February 1943, the Donetsk Basin. The temperature has dropped to 30 degrees below zero, turning the Russian steppe into a rigid, white expanse. Following a failed counterattack, the field is littered with the debris of the Wehrmacht burning half-tracks and hundreds of field-grey forms frozen into grotesque statues of final agony. To any observer, the battle here is over. A Soviet reconnaissance patrol moves through the carnage. They are ghosts in white winter camouflage, their skis hissing softly over the hard-packed ice. They move with the casual confidence of victors, stepping over the fallen, occasionally stopping to check a body for intelligence or weapons, ignoring the pale, waxen faces of the dead. They pass a snow-covered mound indistinguishable from the dozen others around it. But as the patrol moves 10 yards beyond, exposing their backs, the mound shifts. A single puff of steam escapes from a mouth that should be breathless. Slowly, remarkably, the corpse raises an MP-40 submachine gun from beneath a stiffened greatcoat. The finger tightens on the trigger. The silence of the graveyard is about to be shattered, not by the dead, but by a soldier who has turned his own mortality into a trap. To understand why a highly trained soldier of an industrialized nation would resort to the primal, desperate act of feigning death, one must first understand the catastrophic collapse of the German military situation between 1943 and 1944. The early years of the war, the era of the Blitzkrieg, had been defined by speed, motion, and armoured dominance. In Poland, France, and the early days of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht dictated the terms of engagement. They fought from the hatch of a tank or the seat of a half-track. They were the hunters. But by the winter of 1943, following the annihilation of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad and the failure of the massive armoured offensive at Kursk, the strategic dynamic had inverted completely. The hunter had become the prey. The German army was no longer conquering territory. It was trading space for time, bleeding slowly in a fighting retreat across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Eastern Front. The sheer scale of the Soviet counteroffensives meant that German units were constantly outnumbered, outgunned, and encircled. The nature of the fighting changed physically. The clean lines on the map dissolved into a chaotic series of pockets, isolated groups of German troops cut off from their main lines, surrounded by a Red Army that had learned to hate with an intensity that defied description. In these pockets, the traditional rules of warfare, surrender and captivity, were often viewed as a death sentence. Propaganda on both sides, fueled by the atrocities committed by the SS Einsatzgruppen and the brutal retaliation of Soviet partisans, had created a war of annihilation. In this environment, the German infantryman, the Lanzer, found himself stripped of his mechanized support. The Luftwaffe had vanished from the skies. The panzers were burning on the steppe. The war had devolved into a primitive, close-quarters struggle for survival in trenches, ruins, and frozen forests. The cohesive unit structure began to fracture. A company that began the day with 100 men might end it with 5, scattered in shell holes, separated from command, with enemy tanks rolling over their positions. It was in this crucible of disintegration that the tactic of playing dead evolved from an individual reflex into a grim battlefield necessity. It was not a maneuver taught in the boot camps of 1939. It was a behavior learned in the mud of Ukraine and the marshes of Belarus. When a position was overrun and retreat was impossible, the soldier faced a binary choice: stand and die immediately, or merge with the landscape. And in the industrial slaughterhouse of the Eastern Front, the most common feature of the landscape was the dead. The battlefield itself provided the perfect camouflage. By 1944, the density of casualties in sectors like the Cherkassy Pocket or the Falaise Gap in France was staggering. Artillery barrages and Katyusha rocket strikes would churn the earth, leaving fields carpeted with fragmented bodies, destroyed equipment, and churned mud. To the attacking forces sweeping through these areas, the visual information was overwhelming. The human eye struggles to process a field of hundreds of corpses. It glosses over details. It assumes stillness equals death. For the cut-off German soldier, this psychological blind spot became his only armour. He learned that if he could suppress the shivering of his body, if he could tolerate the freezing cold or the swarming flies, and if he could mimic the unnatural, twisted posture of a corpse, he became invisible. He ceased to be a target and became scenery. But unlike the animal instinct of playing possum to avoid a predator, the German intent was often not just survival, it was vengeance. This adaptation was not merely an act of individual cowardice or panic. In many cases, it was a calculated tactical decision driven by the changing geometry of the front line. By 1944, the German army was fighting what military historians call a fluid defense. There were no longer solid, unbroken trench lines stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Instead, the front was a porous, shifting zone of strongpoints and gaps. When a Soviet armoured thrust broke through, it would bypass German infantry positions, leaving them stranded miles behind enemy lines. In previous wars, these units would be considered captured, but the indoctrination of the Wehrmacht, particularly the Waffen SS, emphasized the idea of the active pocket. Soldiers were trained to believe that the front would fluctuate, that a counterattack was imminent, and that their duty was to disrupt the enemy rear until relief arrived. In this context, feigning death became a method of infiltration. A machine gun team might set up a position, fire until their ammunition ran low or they were flanked, and then, as the enemy infantry assaulted the final 50 yards, they would collapse. They would scatter, drop into the mud, smear themselves with blood or dirt, and lie motionless among the real casualties of the firefight. The enemy assault wave, adrenaline pumping, focused on securing the ground and chasing retreating survivors, would sweep over them. The mopping up troops, usually second-line infantry, would follow. Once the main combat power had passed, the corpses would rise. They were now positioned perfectly to strike at the enemy's most vulnerable elements: supply trucks, officers, communications lines, or artillery crews setting up in the captured position. This tactic was exacerbated by the terrain of the late war. In the urban ruins of cities like Aachen, Breslau, or the factory districts of Stalingrad, the distinction between a pile of rubble and a defensive position was non-existent. A soldier lying prone, covered in grey, dust and brick fragments, was invisible. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the dense, suffocating vegetation meant that visibility was measured in feet. A German paratrooper could lie in a ditch, feign death as a US patrol passed, and then engage them from the rear with a burst of MP-40 fire at point-blank range. Furthermore, the equipment of the German soldier aided this deception. The Feldgrau uniform was designed to blend into the somber tones of the European landscape. In winter, the reversible white camouflage smocks turned men into drifts of snow. Unlike the bright khaki of the British or the olive drab of the Americans, which stood out against snow or urban grey, the German silhouette could disappear effortlessly into the background of destruction. Strategic leadership, while rarely issuing formal orders to play dead in written manuals, implicitly encouraged any method that exacted a toll on the enemy. The ethos of the Endkampf, or final struggle, legitimized any ruse. If a soldier could kill one more enemy tank commander by pretending to be a corpse before dying himself, that was viewed as a valid trade in the grim calculus of 1945. Thus, the stage was set. As the Allied armies closed in on the Reich from east and west, they found themselves fighting a ghost army. They were advancing over ground that they technically possessed, yet which remained lethal. The psychological toll of never knowing if the body at your feet was truly dead began to corrode the morale of even the most seasoned Allied units, leading to a brutal spiral of violence that would define the war's final chapter. The act of feigning death is physiologically unnatural. The human body is hardwired to react to threats with movement, fight or flight. To override this instinct requires a suppression of the nervous system that borders on the catatonic. For a German soldier on the Eastern Front, playing dead was not simply a matter of lying down. It was a physical ordeal of immense difficulty. Consider the environmental conditions. In the winter of 1943, temperatures often hovered around 30 degrees below zero. At this temperature, the body involuntarily shivers to generate heat. A single violent shudder or the visible plume of a warm breath against the cold air would betray a position instantly. Soldiers had to master the art of shallow breathing, inhaling slowly through the nose to warm the air and exhaling gently into the snow or the fur of their collars to disperse the steam. They had to force their muscles into a state of rigid tension to stop the shivering, a paradox that burned precious calories and accelerated hypothermia. In the summer months, specifically during the retreats across Ukraine, the challenge shifted from cold to biological torment. A soldier feigning death in a wheat field in July had to endure swarms of flies and mosquitoes settling on his face and eyes. He had to lie motionless while ants crawled over his skin. The stench of actual decomposition from nearby bodies was suffocating, inducing a gag reflex that had to be swallowed. To cough, to swat a fly, or to wipe sweat from one's eyes was to die. This required a discipline that went beyond standard military training. It demanded a dissociation from the self. Memoirs of survivors speak of entering a trance-like state, focusing entirely on a single sound, the crunch of enemy boots on the soil. The psychological pressure of hearing an enemy soldier walking inches from your head, hearing the bolt of a rifle being cycled, or the murmur of foreign voices, without flinching, broke many men. Those who could not master this paralysis were discovered and killed. Those who could became living landmines. If the frozen steppe was the canvas for this tactic in the East, the shattered cities of Europe were its playground in the West. By late 1944, the war had entered Germany itself, turning ancient cities like Aachen and Cologne into moonscapes of pulverized masonry. In this environment, the tactic of the stay-behind dead reached its lethal zenith. Urban warfare creates a three-dimensional chaos where the distinction between a pile of rags and a human body is almost impossible to discern. German defenders, particularly the Volksgrenadiers and remnants of SS units, utilized the rubble to perfection. A soldier would cover himself in the omnipresent grey dust of pulverized concrete. Lying amidst a heap of broken bricks, twisted rebar, and genuine corpses, he became part of the architecture of ruin. In the Battle of Stalingrad, and later in the defense of the Reich, this evolved into rubble spider holes. A sniper would dig a shallow scrape beneath a pile of debris, leaving only a small aperture for observation. When Soviet or American troops cleared the street, checking the obvious windows and doorways, they would often ignore the mounds of debris in the street itself. They assumed the bodies lying in the gutter were the result of the previous hour's artillery barrage. The danger of the urban ghost was that it allowed the enemy to bypass the threat physically. An American squad might secure a building, set up a command post on the first floor, and believed they were safe. But outside, in the courtyard, amidst the refuse of war, a dead German observer was counting them, noting their equipment, and waiting for darkness. At night, the corpse would rise, cut the field telephone wires, throw a grenade through the window, and vanish back into the ruins. It created a sense of paranoia where no ground was ever truly secure, and every shadow held a potential knife. For the Allied soldier advancing across Europe, the realization that the dead could kill spawned a deep, corrosive paranoia. In the early campaigns, there was a tentative respect for the fallen. A body on the field was a tragedy, an object of pity. But as the tactic of the active corpse spread, that pity hardened into a ruthless pragmatism. The American GI in Normandy and the Red Army conscript in Poland learned quickly that assuming a German was dead was a fatal error. This led to the grim evolution of the dead check, or security round. Standard operating procedure for point men shifted. It was no longer enough to visually inspect a body. As a patrol moved through a sector littered with casualties, the lead soldiers would put a rifle round into the bodies they passed, often shooting them in the head or chest from a safe distance. This practice fundamentally altered the psychology of the advance. It dehumanized the enemy completely. To shoot a motionless human being requires a suspension of moral judgment that borders on the sociopathic, yet it became a survival requirement. In the hedgerows of Normandy, where the bocage created a claustrophobic maze of earthen banks and vegetation, the stress was unbearable. Every rustle, every slump of a gray uniform in a ditch triggered a violent reaction. American paratroopers, already operating with high aggression, began to operate on a shoot first, check later basis. The distinction between a corpse, a wounded man attempting to surrender, and a faker lying in ambush vanished. They were all treated as targets. The strategic use of feigning death did more than just inflict casualties. It eroded the unspoken laws of warfare. Under the Geneva Convention and the customary rules of war, a soldier who is incapacitated or surrendering is protected. He is hors de combat, outside the fight. By weaponizing this status, German units committed what is legally known as perfidy, the act of inviting confidence to betray it. The consequence was a cycle of brutality that spiraled out of control. When an Allied unit was ambushed by dead Germans, their reaction was rarely disciplined. The rage of seeing a friend killed by a corpse led to immediate, sweeping retaliation. "Take no prisoners" became a common whispered order. If a German unit raised their hands to surrender after an engagement, they were often met with suspicion and gunfire, because the Allied soldiers simply could not trust that the surrender wasn't another lure. This tactic destroyed the middle ground of the battlefield. It removed the possibility of grace. Medical personnel, tasked with checking bodies to offer aid, became targets. Stretcher bearers were shot because they might be bringing ammunition to a sleeping machine gun team. The battlefield became a zone of total annihilation, where the only safe enemy was one who had been visibly, catastrophically destroyed. The German command's decision to blur the line between the living and the dead forced their enemies to erase that line entirely. August 20th, 1944, the Falaise pocket, Normandy. The German 7th Army is in its death throes, strangled inside a shrinking cauldron of fire and steel. The road leading to the village of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive has ceased to be a thoroughfare and has become a graveyard. Allied pilots, looking down from their Typhoons and Spitfires, call it the corridor of death. On the ground, the scene is apocalyptic. The summer heat is suffocating, magnifying the stench of thousands of decaying horses and men. The road is choked with the burning wreckage of the Wehrmacht's retreat, tiger tanks, stolen French farm carts, staff cars and ambulances, all twisted together in a chaotic sculpture of defeat. The air is thick with black smoke and the relentless buzzing of millions of flies. Advancing cautiously into this inferno is a platoon from the Canadian 4th Armoured Division. They are the anvil against which the German hammer is being shattered. Their orders are simple: close the gap, seal the exit, let no one escape. The Canadian infantrymen move in a staggered column, flanked by Sherman tanks. They are exhausted, eyes stinging from the smoke, boots slipping in the gore that slicks the tarmac. To their left and right, the ditches are piled high with the dead grenadiers from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and paratroopers from the 3rd Parachute Division. These were the elite, the fanatical core of the German defence, now reduced to heaps of field grey rag dolls. Or so it appears. Hidden within a tangled mass of bodies near a burning SDKFZ 251 half-track lies a remnant group of 5 SS Grenadiers. They are not dead, though they are covered in the blood of those who are. They have been lying there for 3 hours. The heat of the burning metal next to them is blistering, singing the hair on their arms. The flies crawl into their ears and noses. They do not flinch. They do not swipe them away. Their commander, a 19-year-old Rottenführer, grips a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon beneath the body of a dead comrade. His instructions to his men were whispered minutes before the Canadians came into view. Wait for the tanks to pass. Kill the infantry. Break the line. The psychological pressure on the Canadians is immense. The sheer volume of casualties makes it impossible to check every body. If they stopped to verify death in every corpse, they would move 10 yards an hour. So they rely on the visual assessment, the unnatural angles of limbs, the catastrophic wounds, the stillness. They walk past the half-track. They walk past the Rottenführer. One Canadian private, a replacement fresh from England, pauses. He sees something inconsistent in the pile, a boot that seems to be bracing against the ground rather than resting limply. He stops. He raises his Lee Enfield rifle, the muzzle wavering slightly. He is 10 feet away from the hidden German. The silence on the road stretches. The Sherman tank engines are a low rumble 50 yards ahead. The private stares at the pile of bodies. The Rottenführer stares back through half-closed eyelids, watching the barrel of the rifle. It is a moment of absolute, crystallized tension. If the German moves, he dies. If the Canadian fires, he initiates a firefight at point-blank range. The Canadian soldier sighs, lowering his weapon, convinced by the flies settling on the German's face that no living thing could remain so still. He turns his back to rejoin his squad. The moment the Canadian soldier turns his back, the illusion of death evaporates. With a primal scream that shreds the heavy afternoon air, the Rottenführer sits up. He does not aim for the soldier who spared him. He aims for the Sherman tank lumbering 30 yards ahead. The Panzerfaust discharges with a hollow thump, followed by a terrifying shriek. The shaped charge slams into the thin rear armour of the Sherman's engine deck. The explosion is deafening. A geyser of flame and oil erupts from the tank, engulfing the turret crew who are scrambling to escape. The metal beast slews sideways, blocking the road, its ammunition beginning to cook off in a series of popping detonations. Chaos reigns. Before the Canadian infantry can comprehend that the tank has been hit, the rest of the dead Germans rise from the ditch. They are grey spectres, coated in gore and dust, erupting from the ground like demons. Their MP-40 submachine guns chatter violently, spitting 9mm rounds into the exposed backs of the Canadian squad. The ambush is devastating in its intimacy. This is not a firefight across a valley. It is a slaughter at arm's length. Men who were checking their maps or lighting cigarettes a second ago are cut down where they stand. The Canadian private who had hesitated is hit instantly, crumpling onto the tarmac, his mercy repaid with a bullet to the spine. The road to Saint-Lambert dissolves into a swirling melee of smoke, screams, and the chaotic rattle of automatic fire. But the ambushers are living on borrowed time. The shock of the attack lasts only seconds. The surviving Canadians, veterans of the Italian campaign and the Normandy breakout, react with a ferocity born of pure rage. They realise the betrayal. The rules of engagement vanish. A sergeant screams that the piles are alive, swinging his Bren light machine gun toward the ditch. He does not fire bursts. He holds the trigger down, raking the pile of bodies with a continuous stream of .303 caliber rounds. He doesn't look for targets. He simply destroys the geography of the ambush. Hand grenades are lobbed into the ditch, not one or two, but dozens. The explosions tear apart the living and the dead indiscriminately, sending plumes of dirt and body parts into the air. The 5 SS grenadiers, having expended their element of surprise, are annihilated in a storm of fragmented steel. The Rottenführer, attempting to reload his weapon, is cut in half by the coaxial machine gun of the 2nd Sherman tank, pushing through the wreckage of the 1st. The engagement ends as abruptly as it began. The firing dies down to scattered shots as the Canadians move through the smoke, dead-checking every single body in the ditch with a ruthlessness that was absent 5 minutes ago. There is no shouting for medics for the German wounded. There are no prisoners taken. The ambush has been repelled, but the psychological victory belongs to the Germans. They have bought 10 minutes of delay, destroyed a tank, and killed a dozen men. But more importantly, they have destroyed the humanity of their enemy. The ambush on the road to Saint-Lambert was a tactical pinprick in the grand scheme of the collapse of the Western Front, but its psychological shockwave was disproportionate. Across the Falaise pocket, similar scenes played out with terrifying frequency. The result was a fundamental shift in the behaviour of the advancing armies. The tentative caution that had characterised the early days of the invasion was replaced by a ruthless, mechanical efficiency in clearing the dead. In the days following the closure of the Gap, Allied burial parties and bulldozer crews faced a grim task. The corridor of death was not a hyperbole, it was a literal description. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, touring the battlefield 2 days later, famously remarked to a reporter that the battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas. He noted that 48 hours after the closing of the Gap, he was conducted through it on foot to encounter scenes that could be described only by Dante. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. Amidst this landscape of total destruction, the fear of the living dead persisted. Reports from the 1st Polish Armoured Division, which had held the critical hill of Mont-Ormel against desperate SS breakouts, noted that German infantry would often feign death until the Polish tanks passed, then rise to fire Panzerfausts into the thinner rear armour. The Polish response was absolute. By the end of August 1944, it became common practice for tank machine gunners to spray any cluster of bodies they passed, regardless of whether they showed signs of life. The expenditure of ammunition on corpses was staggering, but it was deemed a necessary cost of doing business. The strategic consequence was a slowing of the tempo. Allied commanders, realising that bypassed pockets of dead Germans could re-emerge to sever supply lines, were forced to commit significant resources to mopping up operations. Entire infantry battalions had to sweep rear areas, physically checking thousands of bodies. This diverted manpower from the spearhead, buying the retreating remnants of the Wehrmacht precious hours to cross the Seine River. The German tactic of feigning death had failed to turn the tide of the war, but it had succeeded in imposing a friction on the Allied advance that was measured in blood and time. The human cost, however, was the most profound. For the German soldiers who attempted the ruse and failed, the end was summary execution. The unwritten rule of the battlefield dictates that he who fights outside the laws of war dies outside the protection of them. Allied soldiers, finding a German alive in a pile of dead after a firefight, were rarely in a mood to process prisoners. The act of playing dead effectively signed the death warrant for thousands of legitimately wounded men who were killed simply because their captors could not afford the risk of mercy. By the time the Allied armies crossed the Rhine and entered the heartland of Germany in early 1945, the tactic of the active corps had fundamentally altered the doctrine of urban combat. The American and British forces that fought in the ruins of Cologne, Hamburg, and Berlin were no longer the optimistic liberators of 1944. They had become hardened, cynical practitioners of a war of annihilation. The lessons learned from the ambushes in Normandy and the Ardennes had crystallized into a brutal new standard operating procedure: reconnaissance by fire. This doctrine dictated that no space was to be entered until it had been saturated with gunfire. Infantry squads clearing buildings would throw grenades into rooms before kicking down doors. They would spray piles of rubble with Thompson submachine guns before stepping over them. The distinction between a combatant and a casualty was ignored until safety could be absolute. The cost in ammunition was astronomical. Logistical reports from 1945 show a massive spike in small arms expenditure per mile gained. But the cost in blood was deemed too high to pay for caution. The tactic also forced a technological shift. The Crocodile flamethrower tank became a primary tool for clearing the stay-behind threats. If a bunker or a trench line appeared silent but uncleared, commanders would not send men to investigate. They would send a stream of liquid fire. The flamethrower did not discriminate between the dead and the feigning. It simply sterilized the battlefield. This marked the final transition of the war from a contest of maneuver to a process of industrial eradication. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet response was even more uncompromising. The Red Army, having suffered millions of casualties from German deceptions since 1941, adopted a policy of kinetic clearing. Soviet tank columns advancing through Poland and East Germany would often drive their T-34s directly over German trench lines and foxholes, rather than clearing them with infantry. The psychological message was clear: there is no safety in the ground. The corpse tactic had forced the enemy to abandon the concept of occupation in favor of destruction. For the veterans who survived these campaigns, the trauma of the living dead lingered long after the surrender. Post-war psychiatric reports from both American and Soviet hospitals document a specific recurring nightmare among infantrymen: the fear of stillness. Men who had returned to civilian life found themselves unable to walk past a sleeping person without checking for breath. They flinched at the sight of debris on a roadside. The trust that creates a civil society, the assumption that a motionless body is in need of help, not a source of danger, had been cauterized by the war. Ultimately, the strategic legacy of the German dead man tactic was the erosion of the moral framework of the soldier. It proved that in the desperate, nihilistic vacuum of total war, even the final sanctity of death could be weaponized. It forced the victors to become as ruthless as the desperate men they were defeating, ensuring that the final months of the Third Reich were not a military campaign, but a slow, grinding execution. War, at its core, is a chaotic dismantling of civilization, yet we attempt to impose order upon it with rules. We draw lines between the combatant and the non-combatant, between the wounded and the weaponized, between the living and the dead. These distinctions allow soldiers to retain a shred of their humanity amidst the slaughter. But the story of the active corpse reveals the terrifying fragility of those lines. When a soldier is forced to mimic his own extinction to survive, he has crossed a psychological threshold from which there is no easy return. The German use of this tactic was not a stroke of strategic genius. It was a symptom of a collapsing system. It was the desperate gasp of an ideology that had elevated the concept of the Endkampf, the final struggle, above the value of individual life. By encouraging their men to merge with the rotting debris of the battlefield, the German High Command did not just spend their lives, they spent their dignity. They reduced the soldier from a warrior to a trap, stripping death of its finality and its peace. For the Allied and Soviet soldiers who faced these ghosts, the legacy was a permanent scar on the psyche. They returned home to a world of peace, but many carried with them a deep, instinctual distrust of stillness. The tactic forced them to violate the most basic human impulse, the desire to aid the fallen, and replaced it with the necessity to destroy them. It taught a generation of men that mercy was a weakness, and that the only safe enemy was one who had been obliterated. In the end, the fields of the Eastern Front and the hedgerows of Normandy have returned to silence. The grass has grown over the foxholes and the craters. But the history of this tactic remains a chilling reminder of the depths of human desperation. It stands as a testament to the moment when the machinery of total war became so consuming that it erased the boundary between existence and oblivion, leaving behind a world where the living envied the dead, and the dead were never truly at rest.